Shane Kilkelly.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we are reading an article from November of 2019. We're on this track of doing more recent articles, right? We're starting to catch up to the present day. The article is written by Amelia Davenport, and it's called Organizing for Power, Stealing Fire from the Gods. Fun article. Kyle, what's the gist of this? What's the pitch here? What's going on?
So essentially, this article starts by re-examining Taylorism. And so for those of you who are not really familiar with it, because it's definitely like an older phenomenon, Taylorism was an attempt to sort of apply scientific principles of observation to the labor process. And rationalize the labor process. It's very typically associated with the introduction of the assembly line and the enormous efficiency gains that were possible through using the assembly line. And it's often criticized as a group of techniques that are used by capital to de-skill, disempower, and discipline workers towards the ends of increasing profitability. So this article starts off by doing a little bit of a closer reading of Taylor and seeing what did he really say. And the reason why Davenport is looking at this is because I'm not sure what Amelia's pronouns are, but they're trying to look at the techniques of organization, the tactics, the strategies that the left uses as a kind of rule of thumb approach to what the left does as a rule of thumb approach to political change, to activism, which is to say a kind of irrational or ad hoc approach.
Folklore organizing, whatever. Yeah.
Yes. So we've kind of, developed these different strains of leftism, and we have our sacred cows, we have our catechisms and so on. Davenport is sort of saying, well, what if we were to rationalize those? And what kind of falls out of that is a broader discussion about, I guess you could say, the value or lack thereof of worker autonomy, of traditional practices of work, of disciplines of work, sort of craft knowledge, and how that can be compared to the principles of Taylorism, but also the principles of cybernetics, and how that all figures into a discussion of the division of labor, the technical division of labor, which is to say the specific jobs that people do, not in the sense that I am a teacher, but in the sense that I use PowerPoint to instruct, right? That's part of the technical division of labor. But also the social division of labor, which would just be more I am a teacher. I come from this class of individuals within society. And the argument that Davenport kind of ends up with is, if we follow the ideas of Taylor and if we follow the ideas of cybernetics, then we need to break down these kinds of craft traditions towards the ends of a more universal kind of knowing and a more universal kind of labor practice that will get rid of these kinds of privileges or forms of technical domination that we see existing both within capitalist enterprises, but also within previously existing socialism or within government organizations today in the capitalist world, right? It's not necessarily just a thing where capitalist enterprises, we see it kind of across society. If we really want to get over that hump, then we're going to need to seriously rethink our understanding of workers' autonomy, social cooperation, and craft knowledge.
Yep. Oh, nice short 7-minute episode. Thanks for listening. You can catch us on fucking Twitter and all that kind of shit.
We done it.
Yeah.
Fastest GIU ever.
Speed run. Yeah.
Firefox is telling me this is a 137-minute read, and we did 7-minute summary. So I think we've
take that
Davenport machine.
Goddamn. No, more seriously, this will almost certainly be a two-parter, folks. So strap your butts down and get ready for a long one. So yeah, I mean, Davenport opens up with this sort of stuff of like the author is zoning in on like this thing where like we have this like received wisdom on the left. We have the as you said, the catechisms and the saints and that kind of stuff, which is often kind of like principles but not really useful methodologies. Like often doesn't have traction on the world as such. But then like bourgeois systems theory and like the sort of Nicholas Luhmann, this kind of stuff, which we need to get around to reading for the show, but is characterized as being like really solid empirical logical stuff, but lacking in the class analysis. So what we're kind of looking for here is a fusion of these two things. Like, what if we could steal fire from the gods and import this like serious scientific professional fucking approach to analyzing things, and maybe slay some sacred cows as well while we're at it.
Yeah, and to be sort of like fair to the left, we can also see when we go back and like look at the history of systems theory that a lot of this stuff came from the left.
Yeah, totally.
Originally. Not all of it, but a lot of it did. And it's sort of in the process of the left becoming increasingly ossified, hidebound, and sectarian, and in the process of sort of like left scholars interested in systems theory trying to find a place to work and trying to avoid the FBI.
Yeah, totally.
The sort of continuity of systems theory and left thinking got split off, right? Where you have on the one hand, systems theory becomes very sanitized and depoliticized. And on the other hand, you have left organizing becoming more and more traditional and kind of just like a matter of repeating behaviors without a systematic understanding of what the consequences might be.
Indeed. So the author says they're going to take in the tradition of left contrarianism, let's take a look at Taylor and see if there's something useful to excavate there. So, Kyle, what's this trick with like what was Taylor after with his whole scientific management thing? What was the goal of that?
Right. So Taylor's whole thing was this idea of scientific management, which was opposed to existing bourgeois approaches to management that had existed at his time. I believe he was working in like the very early 20th century. Like, isn't it like 1902, something like that? This stuff comes out. Yeah. So the goals of Taylor's principles of scientific management, as you laid them out, were maximum prosperity for the employer coupled with maximum prosperity for each employee. Transforming work so that workers would no longer be either overstrained through exertion or wasting their own time. And finally, improving general labor productivity so that the standard of living of the average person might grow through price reduction. So essentially what we're talking about here is a kind of a rising tide lifts all boats sort of view, right? And something quite similar to a very early form of socialism, which was called Simonianism, which was looking at the class struggle between capital and labor, and as intellectuals trying to find a cool trick to resolve that contradiction, right? If we could just think well enough, this contradiction will be dissolved. That's kind of like the core of Simonian thinking. And it's very similar to what Taylor's doing here. Is like, yeah, let's find a way to do a class compromise that's going to benefit everyone instead of just working to the benefit of one side or the other.
And like, you know, it has to be said, like it's within capitalism, this is kind of quite a naive sort of thing, right? Like it's and Taylor was a bourgeois kind of asshole as well, right? But what we're going to get through this whole piece is like the pitch that it doesn't mean that this is necessarily, you know, like tainted by association, some of these techniques, right? Because one of the main sort of contrasts that's drawn here is the contrast between the kind of, I guess, pre-scientific way of organizing the work process versus the scientific management thing, and where the pre-scientific stuff is basically rule of thumb based, and it's kind of like you know, folklore driven sort of ways of organizing the work effort, where, you know, you have people like you can have workers who are like not getting very much done, but they're also destroying their bodies doing it, you know.
Yes.
Like their limbs are being ripped apart like by the kind of just idiotic fucking like ineffective way they're lifting things or whatever. And then the pitch for the scientific thing is like, hey, look, you'll get more done, and yes, the capitalists will win because of that, but also you won't be fucking dead by the time you're 26, you know. You won't be exhausted by the end of the day, that sort of stuff, right? And there's like a contrast here of like, the rule of thumb methods did have some kind of autonomy to them, or there's a sort of romantic autonomy there. But, you know, there really is something to be said for this kind of like thing of like doing science on yourselves. Obviously, we would like to decouple that from the capitalist kind of profit imperative stuff. And that means like the techniques can still be useful in a socialist society where, you know what, like getting shit done pretty quickly so you can go home and rest, you know, probably a good thing in socialism, right? Like to reduce the workday, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely see the Taylorist perspective being opposed to something like the arts and crafts movement, or something like Heidegger, Heidegger's politics, right? Like the idea of the importance of the Zuhanden, right? The two hand, right? Like it, like, you know, that sort of like immediacy with the labor process being a kind of like core authentic experience, right, of what it is to be human. Taylor is very skeptical of that, because Taylor is looking at all these rules of thumb that individual workers or small groups of workers have for like how to best do some kind of practice, and is kind of saying like, well, first of all, there's no real way to compare these, right, for the workers. They're not interested in comparing the ones to see which is best. And furthermore, because they're so engaged in the labor process, they don't have the time or energy to actually evaluate that as an observer, right? And that observer's perspective is something that Heidegger was very skeptical of, but Taylor sees as quite valuable to creating a kind of positive feedback loop of examination, consideration, refinement, and then implementation, right?
Yeah, totally. So the term that he uses, or the term that's used for the pre-scientific thing, is management by initiative and incentive, where, how does this break down? So that the workers have their handicraft knowledge, which the managers don't. And so the workers are working on their own initiative and their own knowledge, right? And then the managers can only use positive incentives like raises and promotions, or like negative incentives like firing, in order to regulate that process. And this is an impoverished regulator, right? Like this ends up being a pretty ineffective way to do things.
So there's the things that the managers can do are provide raises and promotions, fire people as a negative incentive, and then use personal charisma to kind of raise morale among the workers, right? So like if you got a likable boss, then you might be a little bit more invested in your work, right? That's the kind of thing that's going on.
So It's interesting there that you've got, on the one hand, you have this romantic handicraft autonomy sort of notion, coupled to brute domination, right? What Beer would really frown on as being this is a really shitty way of regulating the work process, right? You've got this very unstable loop between these two things. And the managers only have these extremely crude tools of very violent algorithmic signals to adjust the process at all.
That's right. And so the problem is that the interaction is neither fine-grained enough nor responsive enough nor tightly coupled enough, right? It's very much that picture of the manager sitting up in the office above the workspace, looking down at the work floor. The glare. Maybe. Yeah, but then, just kind of being completely removed from the labor process. It's seen as by Taylor as just this is a huge problem.
I think it should also be pointed out as well that even though we have this kind of romantic, autonomous, semi-autonomous kind of handicraft knowledge, the workers aren't actually self-managing. They're not free. They are under the glare of management, and a rather baleful glare at that, because if fucking something up isn't we should adjust the process and tune up how these things go. No, the fucking it up is you get fired. On one hand, it seems quite romantic. It's and this is a tradition in socialist thought as well of we should go back to this craft knowledge autonomy stuff. But I don't know. In practice, it wasn't that fucking great either. This wasn't exactly a golden age of worker self-management, was it?
Yeah, and I've definitely worked in workplaces where management by initiative and incentive was more or less the norm. So, for example, working as an adjunct in Japan, I was basically just hired to teach this many hours or this many courses. And the management was entirely hands off. It was just an evaluation at the end, did you provide the course? And there was really not much interaction. So on the one hand, that does provide a kind of ideal of autonomy, because it's I'm making my own courses. I'm able to set my own goals for the most part. I'm able to manage my own students without interference from management on that. So there's a lot of autonomy, but also there's a lot of sort of floundering around. Trying to get at techniques that work and doing a lot of really kind of self-destructive behaviors just because you don't know any better, right? I'll try to teach it. I'll try to grade papers this way, and then I'll try to grade it another way. And you don't really have a very good way to evaluate which is better. And you kind of work yourself to the bone because you're just always trying to figure out something that works. And you're kind of off on your own, doing your own thing. And so I definitely understand what Taylor is getting at here, because in those cases where I've been in workplaces where I'm not being micromanaged, but there is more of a collaborative and social atmosphere, and I'm being taught best practices, which I may or may not accept, but at least I'm being exposed to them. I found that to be, it's still a capitalist workplace, right? But there is when you do learn one of these effective techniques and integrate it into your teaching or your work, there is a kind of satisfaction to that and a kind of relief to just be okay, well, finally, I'm not just doing everything on my own.
And you're better off for it, You're just better off.
Yeah, I'm not just groping around in the dark. You know?
one of the concrete sort of examples that's brought up in the article from Taylor's time to like give an illustration of how this process worked is his improvement of like the handling of pig iron. So basically loading big trailers or trains full of iron or whatever the fuck that stuff is. And it's done by hand, you know, it's proper manual labor. And I should clarify as well, like just for the listeners who are maybe not quite caught up with us, we're not standing for Taylor, right? Like we're just, like, this whole, a good chunk of this article is kind of a really good faith devil's advocate sort of thing of like, what if we just looked at this and tried to take a lesson from it? We're not standing for capitalist workplaces that, you know, because like it still sucks even if the work process has improved a bit, all that kind of stuff aside. The pig iron example is really interesting because, you know, looking at the process, folks weren't getting very much done. They were loading, you know, X quantity of iron onto, or like they were loading whatever 3 trailers worth a day, which is pretty damn low. But they were also fucking exhausted. Like their arms were falling off and their backs were being destroyed. And then Taylor comes along, looks at it and okay, what's going on here? Well, people are lifting things. And the important stuff with lifting is weight and duration of the lift. So can we look at those and break them down scientifically? Can we build curves of like weight versus time and all this kind of stuff? Can we find the optimal sort of points? Can we find the maximums and minimums? And it turns out, yeah, there is a maximum amount of weight you can carry and a maximum duration per day that you can carry those kinds of weights, after which it's just over. And the worker is exhausted. Also, they're damaged, you know, physically fucking damaged, and they just have to sit it out. So he then goes, well, what if we rejig the work process to do like, I don't know, a bucket chain or whatever, where people are lifting lighter weights for shorter durations. They can get 30 times as much stuff done and not be exhausted. And also their arms aren't falling off now. So like, it's an example of that thing where, you know, Taylor's attempt at like a win-win scenario does pay off, like kind of legitimately in a lot of these cases where like, hey guys, you are honest to God better off doing it the scientific way. Your old folklore-based fucking like romantic notions of doing it your own way, they're gonna fucking kill you. Like there's a reason why most of you guys go out of here with broken backs by the time you're 30. Maybe try being smart for once instead, you know. So that's something really to grapple with there. That like, you know, it's you're better off doing science on like. And you know, for clarity, then like the limit of Taylor's thing is that like he fully believes that the only way this can work is if management do the science. And labor is basically excluded from that scientific process. The thing that's being proposed here is, what if we stole fire from the gods and we did this ourselves? We do science in ourselves, both in the now as we're developing the coming revolution, and also afterwards. In the socialist society, aren't we going to need scientific ways of working that get a lot of shit done in a very short space of time and don't kill us while we're doing it? That's a pretty, you know, that's a good pitch. I think that's really worth taking seriously.
Yes. And I mean, it does have to be said that the other sort of limit to this is that it is a win-win in many cases. But of course, the bosses are winning more than the workers.
Yeah. It's intensification, certainly. Right.
It's typically going to mean an improvement in the work process in terms of strain and so on. And it's also typically going to mean somewhat higher wages. But of course, the bulk of the gain is going to go to the profitability of the enterprise that goes to the owners, because this is a capitalist enterprise.
Because, like, I mean, even the way the numbers work out here or whatever, I'm not going to look it up in the article, but like it's like 30 times as many trains loaded, and then the workers get a 60% bonus. It's like, meh. Those numbers don't quite work out, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
but
exactly.
The trick then is that, like, in our socialist utopia, that productivity gain could be used not for intensification, but for work reduction. That, like, you get your shit done, like, in 2 hours and you go home and just, I don't know, play with your kids, drink, do whatever the fuck you want. There is still, like, treating it in this kind of instrumental way has its kind of problems, right? But there's the kernel of something very useful to the socialist project there of, like, hey, you know, maybe the work process could eventually disappear, like in that kind of like fragment on machines kind of way, right? It would just get so automated and so scientificized that it would disappear from view, right?
Yes. And the justification for Taylor is that, like, it's okay that the gains are so lopsided on the side of management because there is a natural rightness to the social division of labor.
Oh, yeah, like, he's a total asshole.
These manual workers are doing manual work because that's all they're good for.
Yeah. He was like a fucking Darwinist or something. He was like some sort of eugenics adjacent sort of asshole, wasn't he?
Yeah. But just to make it clear, like, why Taylor thought that was okay wasn't necessarily because he was like a huge stand for capital or anything like that. It was more because he just kind of had this like, yeah, the social division of labor is fixed. So how can we make the best of it kind of situation? So
what we're saying there is that like if Taylor by accident was born in Russia instead, he would have ended up doing the same shit. Like it would just like the ideological commitment isn't really there. It's just like, no, these people are swine. They should be worked hard and extracted from.
Yeah, which was totally the attitude of like many like the majority of that sort of like Bolshevik middle layer of managers, right? They had a very, very low opinion of your average worker, and the idea of sort of like intense hierarchy of the social division of labor was like pretty much fully endorsed in the USSR. So, Taylor's ideas would have been at home there. Of course, they didn't actually work very well when they were implemented in the USSR.
A bunch of shit didn't work very well in West.
Yeah, it's like, there's that story of like the Soviets getting Fiat to build a factory for them, and then the factory requiring like 4 times as much labor as it did in Italy, even though it's exactly the same factory, just because of like the weirdness of the Soviet state, right?
There's for the listeners, there's a recent Swampside episode about that. I think it's the title of something like a clock without a spring. Go listen to it. It's great. This brings us on to the next section, initiative and incentive in leftist organizing, which is, I love these kind of like just scathing indictments. So we have a quote here. The initiative and incentive model of management is the standard method of leftist groups. Organizers, through their personal charisma and promise of winning immediate gains, incentivize people to use their initiative towards their campaigns. Group members receive general tasks and an expectation to complete them, either by themselves or with a few other people. It doesn't matter whether it's the top-down orders of the leadership or democratic vote by the group. Activists are tacitly encouraged to take on an unsustainable load, leading to burnout. Motivating activists in leftist organizations is a mixture of generating enthusiasm through charismatic interventions by leaders, whether they consider themselves leaders or not, or through peer pressure and guilt, which organizers leverage to build commitment. The routine cancellation of leftists by activists and policing of cultural consumption are examples of mechanisms for disciplining activists to the will of organizers. Ooh, just scorched.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the really interesting turn that this article takes, right? It's because it's not just saying, oh, what if we applied Taylorism to socialist labor? It's saying, what if we applied Taylorism to today's leftist organizing, right? And it's kind of like that thing where the analysis is being applied to the people who are usually doing the analyzing, right? It reminds me a lot of Bourdieu's sort of, thing where he turns Marxist or sort of Marxian cultural critique back on the university intelligentsia, right? And there's an episode of The Partially Examined Life where they look at Bourdieu and they're sort of like awkward squirming as they have to do some really uncomfortable introspection, is truly priceless. And I really appreciate this kind of similar move we see here of like, well, yeah, but isn't organizing and isn't activism a kind of labor too? And why do you think it's not? Mm-hmm. Like, where's that coming from, huh?
This resonates so strongly with a lot of the stuff we've been saying all along, right? Like the need to take organizing an organization and the project of building socialism to take that fucking seriously. Yeah, I love this essay. I love this passage. The author then moves on towards the more like a little bit more concrete kind of recommendations, right, for this kind of just basically, like, I think it boils down to clearing out all these untested rules of thumb, all this like folklore fucking nonsense, the received wisdom and all that kind of shit, and doing science on ourselves instead.
And yes, and importantly, this question applies whether you are a member of a vanguardist group, right? Or you're a member of some kind of like, standard social democratic party, or you're the member of some kind of anarchist organization. Nobody is immune to this kind of question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's because it's there's so much of this stuff, right? Of like, it's trots selling newspapers, it's anarchists doing community gardens or whatever, and it's like across the board, it's all this going through the motions shit of like, why do we do any of this kind of stuff? Literally out of fucking habit, because there's no alternatives. And why are there no alternatives? We refuse to take the alternative seriously. Just
yeah. Well, like Davenport gives like a sort of equation for what these rules of thumb usually look like, right? So there's the Vanguard Party plus democratic centralism or mass line plus newspaper sales plus electoralism plus entryism plus communist saint worship and so on, versus anarchism plus decentralization plus quote unquote grassroots organizing plus propaganda of the deed plus syndicalism plus direct service plus permaculture. I love how the final one in both of those lists is the punchiest.
It's like, it's wonderful.
Oh, and gardening, of course.
Yeah.
We gotta have that gardening in there, no matter what. So like, these are sort of like clusters of tradition that have coalesced over time, and depending on which label you want to apply to yourself of being a quote unquote communist or a quote unquote anarchist, you're probably going to participate in these behaviors because that's what those organizations do, and that's what it means to have that identity. But maybe we don't need to just inherit tradition wholesale. I mean, you would hope so, given that we're communists, and that's not really supposed to be our thing, right?
Uh-huh. What's that fucking the Marx bit about like, the tradition of dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, and it's like we've gotten ourselves to the fucking point where that's true of us, right? Like, it's just our own fucking traditions are weighing us down and all this kind of stuff. It's sickening, really, when you think through it, because the project is so serious, the stakes are so fucking high, and kind of would really. I'm with the author here of just like, please take this shit seriously, like, and be fucking professionals about it. Not in the sense of like the vanguardist, like, professional revolutionary thing, but just like professionalism, as in answer a fucking email when it comes in, or show up to things, or tell people things, or write shit down, or use a calendar, any of that kind of stuff. Like, just nuts and bolts kind of professionalism of like doing the revolutionary process.
And I think there's like, kind of something beyond that too, which is to say like you, shit, I've lost my point.
Oh, well.
You're talking about
professionalism, but not in the in the vanguardist kind of professional revolutionary sense, but instead the kind of professionalism that, like, because I mean, like, I come out of software development, right? And like, there's a lot of just basic nuts and bolts, like organizing of our work and organizing of collaboration, which is like immediately applicable to organization of social movements, right? But it's either not known or it's written off as being like a fucking bourgeois spook. It's like, oh, you're using a calendar to coordinate your shit? Oh, get out of here, fucking Rockefeller, or whatever. And yeah, it's just like, just that kind of behavioral professionalism. Like the author, like this article's long, right? There's a lot of stuff here, and it's really worth reading. There's a couple of examples through here of like stuff like accountability and like responsibility and, kind of rating and ranking each other as like in terms of like soundness. Like can these people be trusted? Is this person capable of carrying out this this work? If not, they should be trained to, and they should be trusted to do it with the appropriate procedures of like, because like nobody's born knowing this stuff. But it should be part of the movement to teach ourselves and teach each other how to be responsible for ourselves and for each other, and that's the kind of professionalism I'm talking about there, of like, and even like the way the author frames the stuff is always in terms of, it's not like, individual personal discipline of just like wearing the hair shirt or getting whipped or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not a matter of the professional being that kind of like infinitely self-sacrificing person of like, which like, sort of like Lenin is the ideal, right? Where like he worked himself to death for the revolution.
Which is unprofessional, in fact, like it's unsustainable and it's not real.
Yeah. Well, and I think like there is a certain amount of there's a certain degree to which I am cautious about using the term professionalism for reasons we're going to get into later in this essay with the discussion about like, there's a real sort of attempt here to say we don't want to make this about developing a set of skills for a profession. As you were saying, we want to, if we come up with an innovation for organizing, we shouldn't use that as a special advantage against other workers or against other activists. We should bring everybody up to that level of competency. And that's kind of where I see it being a little bit different from professionalism, which is about establishing professions. Like typically it's about establishing professions against the mass of workers, right? Saying like, yeah, but I'm different because of X, Y, Z. So I just want to like, make clear that we're not saying we need a professional cadre of activists who are going to be like so much better than your average worker. It's more about disseminating whatever effective methods or perspectives exist to everyone out there who can make use of it.
Yeah, that's a much better way of putting it. Is there a better term than professionalism for what I'm getting at there? Or maybe there isn't. I don't know.
I don't know if there's something that Davenport uses here. It may come up in the discussion, but I think it is. Often there's the resort to saying like it is a scientific approach, right? Or it is a systemic approach. Instead of saying it is a professional approach. But obviously, we kind of stumble over the language here because we're dealing with a very deeply ingrained like contradiction or break in society, right? That like is. And that break, as this article will identify, the fault line is technique, right? So when we're talking about coming up with better techniques, it's not surprising that we kind of fall into that idea of professionalism, because that's kind of what makes professionals have social power, is having better techniques, right?
And we're explicitly talking here about disseminating those techniques and liquefying the professional class, or like breaking down that distinction so that it's not a thing that's hoarded amongst a particular cadre.
It's also like something that the article will get into is like, this is like a trap that Lenin fell into, right? Because Lenin was kind of aiming for what we're talking about, but the sort of prejudices of the professional managerial class led him towards reproducing that kind of technical domination. So it's, you know, especially for people like ourselves who have technical knowledge and that gives us a little bit of a premium in terms of our labor value. We really have to do a lot of self-examination to avoid falling into that trap, because that's what we've been brought up with for our entire lives.
It's almost as if we've always lived in capitalism, right? And it's sunk into our cores, you know. It's like but it's a thing we absolutely have to constitute ourselves against, right? We have to be on watch for that in our own behaviors and in our language. We need to do the whole culture thing and invent new language for this. We then come on to some sort of really interesting sections about like training and this sort of thing, and like kind of central to Taylor's whole shtick is the notion that people can improve, like they can be taught things and become better at things, and like this also ties up with the notion of like aptitude being measurable, and like, or aptitude for a given task being a measurable thing, which also means that like if you identify that, you know, one worker is really good at it and another worker isn't so much, that's a thing to like, the second person should be trained to become better, right? Like it really should be a rising tide lifts all boats sort of thing, and people should be improved, and people can be improved is really central to this notion, right?
Yes, and this is a point where Taylor's recommendations and the sort of pop culture understanding of Taylorism are really divergent, right? Because the image of Taylorism we have is, you know, modern times, right? The Chaplin movie, right? It's the individual being subordinated to the machine in the way that Marx describes, right? And the machine is very insensitive to the variety of individual workers. So it's like there is a manner in which to do this task, and everyone should be able to perform it exactly the same way. And if you don't, you're just going to be destroyed, right? Whereas Taylor was very much more about understanding where people's level of aptitude was, trying to increase that, but also not forcing the matter or creating a one-size-fits-all solution, which is really, really different from what we usually mean when we say Taylorism.
It's part of this. It's the specialization of labor, right? That like it is fine and good and in fact desirable to specialize and to be like, oh look, like Alice really likes, I don't know, banging this thing with a wrench or whatever, turning this valve, and Joe likes this other thing. Well, fine, let them fucking do it. Like, just and let them get really good at doing those things, and like consult with them as like, hey, what do you actually want to do? What do you want to get good at? And that sort of thing. Yeah, it's great, and that applies to the left organizing stuff as well. Of like, if folks are struggling to organize events, like fucking train them. Like, you know, get people who know what to do to like teach them how to do stuff. For Davenport, this also ties in with like the kind of this what's the term she uses, the comradely cooperation, right? And the cooperative commonwealth and that sort of thing. Of like, if you're running a movement, or if you're involved in a movement, and say a person is like kind of constantly missing meetings because of parental commitments, that's a clear indicator that you as an organization must provide childcare on site with your meetings. Like this always has to be a thing of like lifting people up, not like, oh, they're a flake, they need to get chucked, you know?
Yeah, which is, you know, like a huge challenge for organizing, because yeah, you're going to have people who come from very different material means and very different educational backgrounds. And like, I mean, it's a serious challenge because it's very easy to get frustrated.
I think the thing about the educational backgrounds thing ties in with a thing I was trying to get to earlier, but I think it didn't really land. It was that like, there's stuff that like for either, you know, white collar workers, your software developers, or kind of, you know, anyone in that kind of realm, there's kind of nuts and bolts organizational techniques and just like personal productivity techniques that are just normal, right? Like completely, almost unremarkable, right? Like just, writing shit down and like making checklists and checking them off. And like, you can't assume that everyone's already going to know that. And the way to solve that is to teach them it, like teach people how to use things, teach them how to like keep a calendar properly and that sort of stuff. That's the kind of thing Davenport's getting at here, is that we should be building not like an elite cadre of professionals who know what to do, but building this like cooperative commonwealth of and spreading this knowledge and the skills as far and wide as possible.
Yeah, and it's like it's really something that I had to do a lot of sort of like self-reflection and deprogramming to get over as a teacher, because the sort of values that were instilled in me as a student were like kind of, real emphasis on the value of student autonomy, which means like in practice kind of saying if you don't have what it takes to be an autonomous learner and to think your way around sort of open-ended, vague problems, you're kind of a hopeless case, right? And like we'll give you like, exercises to work through to try to develop those skills. But if you can't hack it, then
you're screwed.
That's your fault, because you're an autonomous learner, right?
Extremely neolive ideology there, right? That like you're just this completely atomized individual who can't be helped, right? You either got it or you don't, kid, and that kind of shit,
It really is, but it's very common in the academic left, I would say. And I think that's for reasons that we will like sort of examine as we get further into this essay. And sort of overcoming those prejudices as a teacher was a very difficult process, because it's you go through a lot of education and some values get very deeply ingrained into you. So kind of coming around to this point of view, I think is really valuable, but it can be quite a challenge, and that's okay. It's all right to fall down, but like taking this kind of approach, you're going to hurt the least amount of people you can, and probably improve the lives of the most people you can.
Yeah.
So yeah,
there's an interesting kind of like concrete example here that I think resonates with a lot of what you said. That like where the author is pointing to Taylor's like emphasis of like object lessons, like really practical lessons, basically. Like you don't just yammer theory at people, you like use illustrations and practical illustrations for them, which is great, and it's something that resonates with Dewey's theory of education. But then this stuff gets picked up and kind of ran with in the wrong way, as like some educators believing that, oh well, like if practical example driven stuff is the way to go, then like fully autonomous, like self-directed examples are the way to go. Like, as in, you just let the kids let them loose in the like sandbox and let them figure it out themselves, which I think is the bad kind of autonomy that you were talking about, right? That like
that's 100% what I was brought up with as a student. Teachers saying, I'm not going to give you a subject for your essay. You need to come up with that for yourself because you need to be an autonomous scholar.
Which is a kind of brutal Darwinian kind of like way of weeding out the weak,
and like it's often couched in a sense of like, this is a university. We're not like the rat race, the corporate environment where you are given deliverables and clear criteria, because we're training you to think critically. And what that means is you need to be able to take a vague parameter and produce something as a result of that using really open-ended thinking. And, Dewey's point was sort of like, no, that's wrong, because there needs to be sort of examples used to work your way up to that structure, and also support from someone who actually knows what they're doing to kind of like give you the nudge you need in the right direction, as opposed to the kind of like sink or swim, figure it out approach. So it's kind of like Taylor or sort of Dewey's ideas sort of split in two directions, right? Is like the one way is the kind of fully open-ended, just like do your own thing, man, kind of approach, versus the other approach that falls out of Deweyism, which is like, object lessons with no broader theoretical context, right? It's just like, like the way that mathematics is usually taught, right? Like, I'm going to learn how to calculate a hypotenuse. And I like, how do I use that? I don't know. But
cool triangle, though.
I sure know how the Pythagorean theorem works. Yep, that's the thing.
Yeah. This is why I combined with my ADHD. This is why I've been so terrible at math and a lot of these kind of things, because the teaching methods, like looking back on them, absolutely fucking sucked. It was like a lot of this kind of stuff is so recognizable from my own education.
And it's like the difficult thing about being a teacher is you're repeating a lot of the same patterns you recognized were bullshit when you were a student, but you can't do anything else.
You live long enough to become the
institution guy, right? Is pushing you in that direction, and you're like,
Yeah. There's one sort of interesting little tidbit at the end of this section before we get on to the next one, about like kind of the old like functional foreman sort of thing, like the kind of supervision of the work process. That's a part of Taylorism. Davenport's point is that, that can just be applied to self-management. You just have rotating responsibilities. Rotate whoever's the supervisor every day in communism.
Well, it's so the idea of functional supervision is to take the idea of the foreman, which is, just like basically the NCO, the sergeant of labor, right? The person who manages the line workers, and break up the tasks of the foreman functionally according to different roles among a number of different managers. Now, having 7 bosses sounds like hell. But this isn't really that. It's more about, one person is there to just observe the labor process and make notes about it to share, right? And another person is in charge of mediating conflicts or whatever, right? Like these different roles that a foreman would provide. And what Davenport is saying is like, for Taylor, splitting it up into those 7 people, each of those had to be a trained white-collar worker because they're the only ones with the brain power to actually do this stuff.
And also almost certainly a white worker. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. And Davenport's saying, well, actually, if you think about this, like the fact that these are divided up functionally means that the functional roles can be rotated among the workers for self-management. So it's not just having like one manager rotating. It's like each of these separate functional management roles can be continuously rotated to build up a general skill set.
Which gets us like wonderfully in the direction of the kind of VSM stuff, right? Like the kind of, you can have these like supervisory and management functions and these like regulatory functions just completely deterritorialized off of the body of particular people. And they're now collective functions that are performed rather than being like, oh, I'm the king. I'm the little fucking general guy or whatever. Because like that sort of old school way of doing it, right, with like the general or whatever, or the sort of like single supervisor. It's a kind of homunculus theory of coordination, where the work process needs to be coordinated, and the answer is to put a little man at the nexus of coordination. And what we're getting through Taylor and then through Davenport is and the VSM stuff is to just blow that shit wide open and like have it not be located on the body of a person at all. Have these like coordination functions be a shared responsibility in the workforce ultimately, like in our ideal socialist workplace.
Yeah. And that's getting at breaking up the social division of labor, right? The sort of misplaced concreteness of, well, this person is this kind of role, so that means that they're essentially this kind of person, right? Like that kind of like, Platonic idea of like, well, there's the gold people, and the gold people have gold people traits. That's not what we're aiming at here.
Yeah, definitely. So what's this this kind of last section for this episode, I think, is going to be this unified science bit. So kind of what's all this about?
So if we take this point of view that we need to break down the social division of labor, right? We need to say have these rotating roles. And if we blow that out from just like the context of an individual workplace into like the broader social division of labor, then it becomes clear that like what we really need is a general mastery of technical knowledge, because what that is going to do is it's going to prevent the creation of a class that dominates through its monopolization. So this is Davenport's words, the monopolization of the technical knowledge to direct production and transmute the inputs of production, including the expended life force of workers, into wealth. So that monopolization of technical knowledge is a major obstacle to actually like getting to a functional socialism or getting to communism, right? And so what we can do in order to make that happen is create this general mastery, or create what, is often called like a kind of like a unified science. So there's a history to these sorts of ideas, right? So, one thing that Davenport says is that this whole idea really problematizes Marx's focus on the ownership of the means of production, right? So you seize the means of production, seize the means, that's the rev.
Owning the tools.
You got that done, yeah. You're good, you're golden, right? That's kind of a very simplistic look at Marx, but Marx's focus on that was real, obviously. And that's kind of a product of the time he was working in, because technical knowledge in Marx's time in the workplace was mostly manifest in the form of tools, right? Very concrete means of production that you use. It like those machines appeared as manifestations of capitalist power on the work floor, right? And simultaneously, you didn't have any kind of professional management, right? Because management was this management by incentive and what was the other initiative and incentive. Management by initiative incentive was the norm. Owners typically had no direct they didn't have any kind of professional managerial techniques. They didn't have these massive management bureaucracies that exist today. And science was also completely disorganized, or very lightly organized. It was this is the age of the gentleman scientist, right? It's just kind of like rich dudes doing science as a hobby. And so when you look at like those sorts of characteristics and how they differ from what happened in the 20th century, you can understand why Marx's focus was on the ownership of the means of production, because they were tools, you could own them, and if you did own them, you pretty much owned the effective power of technique and science in society. But Davenport's saying, look, that focus is not invalid, right? Like, it's still important to own the means of production, but it's not sufficient, right? So capital monopolizes technical knowledge. And this means that worker ownership is kind of analogous to what you might call like a formal democracy, right? Like, yes, if I work at a worker-owned enterprise, I get a vote in the direction of things, but really I don't have power over the enterprise, because if I'm not a manager, if I'm not an engineer, then I don't have the technical knowledge to direct production. And that gives those people a kind of veto power over the direction of the enterprise, because they can just withhold their labor and then you're screwed, right? Furthermore, the law of value, so the way in which market interactions shape decision making of firms and individuals, sort of market pressures, those are important, and Marx's focus on that was important. The sort of value form stuff is important. But if you look at institutions that are largely insulated from the market, like, say the Pentagon, which has it has its suppliers, and there's this tiny set of suppliers, and it just gets just shovel loads of money from the American government, you still see this technical monopolization and domination happening in those organizations, which suggests that the law of value isn't definitive in structuring domination.
Yeah. And Davenport kind of she uses the term like a dependency, right? Like she's drawing the analogy with feudalism here, that capitalism is still preserving these like dependency relations of like, you are an impoverished serf who doesn't know how to run shit, and I am the person who knows how to run things. That's still preserved. And yeah, it's preserved even in the absence of like real kind of commodity wage labor conditions, like in civil and military bureaucracies. That dependency thing is still there. I mean, I've worked in like the civil service over here, and like in a department that was like completely shielded from like market pressures, and yes, like all that same domination was still there. Like getting rid of the value form didn't solve that problem.
Yeah, and I mean, you can of course say that like the value form does condition at the most abstract level decision making in an important way, and it does. It's just like, yeah, but is that really sufficient to explain the sort of suffusion of these kinds of forms of domination in every kind of organization? Or is maybe they're a little bit more direct explanation for what's happening there? Yeah.
I think just because I've been reading Eric Olin Wright's Understanding Class, and I think it's a thing from the Weber tradition of sociology. The whole notion of like opportunity hoarding comes in there, and this would be that. It also gives us like a kind of some explanatory force, or some kind of forced explanation for why is it that like supposedly socialist economies replicate the same fucking domination, right? Like even without the law of value operating, and like somebody's going to at us with reams of fucking obscure shit about like analysis of the Soviet Union or whatever. But this kind of technical domination, or this opportunity hoarding, this dependency relation stuff, this like kind of abstract parent-child relationship between levels of the society is still preserved, and that's where kind of a lot of the domination is, even if you're not doing market commodity stuff.
Right. We can kind of get into a debate about the value form, et cetera, but if you just ask any socialist or anarchist or communist of any kind, whatever, is the division of labor a significant obstacle to communism? I think pretty much everybody's going to go, yeah, it is actually.
Of course.
Right? Yeah. Like this is real. Like this is a really elementary point when you don't kind of get into that like big social theory kind of questions and just kind of look at it as like a really obvious question. Yeah, no, it's a big obstacle, and it is an obstacle across all forms of organization in society. So this kind of leaves us at an impasse, right? It's very common to sort of say, well, okay, that's a problem. So like as a Leninist, I'm going to do the theorizing and the strategizing, but I'm going to be real concerned about the workers. Mm-hmm. Or
I'm going to be virtuous while I'm dominating them, right?
Yeah. No, it is an appeal to personal virtue, right? That like your sense of camaraderie and humanity overrides the technical divisions and the contradictions in society. And similarly, as an anarchist, you might say, well, okay, yeah, social division of labor is a major problem. So we're going to create like totally flat organizations and root out any instance of that existing. With like just kind of, we're just, you know, it's kind of like the like I don't see race sort of approach, right? Like it's like, you know, like if we just kind of think like if we're just impartial enough and we care enough about people as people and not as roles, then we're going to get past this.
Which is another virtue idealism, right?
It is, and it's kind of where this stuff falls flat, because this is a very significant problem. Like eliminating the division of labor is obviously a major impasse for Marxism, right? Because Marx does identify the division of labor as like a fundamental structuring feature of class society. Even if, you know, his focus is on the ownership of the means of production in the revolutionary equation. So there is sort of like a tradition of Marxism that is generally not that well known because it was suppressed in the Soviet Union, but which Davenport sort of draws on here a lot. And this tradition was focused on the creation of a unified world science that's necessary to overcome disciplinary intellectual barriers that prevent sharing and general intelligence. So one of these people that was really key to this was Alexander Bogdanov. Basically, this guy was one of the precursors to cybernetics and systems theory in his thinking. And he developed this idea of techtology as a kind of like proto-systems theory, you might say. It was an attempt to kind of like overcome these the limitations of these two competing ways of doing science, which was dialectical materialism, which is kind of associated with the USSR on one hand, and positivism, which was kind of associated with like bourgeois science on the other. This guy, pretty much his ideas were consonant with people like Otto Neurath. And he was similarly like Neurath, he was really influenced by Ernst Mach, who is somebody that Lenin criticized the hell out of in a very famous pamphlet. Given that Bogdanov's ideas and the sort of influences he had were opposed to Lenin, kind of didn't bode very well for his future as an intellectual in the USSR. His ideas were attacked by both the Hegelians and sort of like more like diamat focused Bolsheviks. So when we read plenty at the beginning of the book, when the sort of advocates of cybernetics are having an argument with like the old diamat people, and the diamat people are trying to use sort of like Marxist jargon to beat them over the head, and there's a sudden reversal of roles. It's kind of like, you know, a lingering example of this conflict, right? That happened between these people who were in favor of kind of like systems approaches versus people who were in favor of more like doctrinaire, was what Davenport calls like Manichaean understandings, right? Like there's the Soviet way of doing things, and then there's the bourgeois way of doing things. And yeah, it's the good way and the bad way. And it's all about just determining who's on the good side or who's on the bad side.
Yeah. It's like a fucking miasma theory of science. It's fucking crazy. What happened to Bogdanov? Did he get the old braka cacao, or did he escape or whatever? You know?
You know what? This article doesn't actually get into that. So let's.
It seems like he would have got gulagged. Maybe, I don't know.
I can't imagine it went well for him. Died in 28.
Okay, that sounds like it didn't go well for him.
Doesn't sound super great.
It sounds like around the right time frame for what I'm thinking of.
Died in Moscow, sounding even worse. So yeah, he later years in death. Interesting.
Okay.
So he was not executed.
Interesting. Deeply interesting. What happened?
He was politically suppressed, and it seems he may or may not have committed suicide. But it didn't end well for him. And so this is he's a figure that's pretty well known by people who know a lot about the history of the USSR. Or even people who are like really into systems theory, but beyond that, I think he's not that well known. So we'll have to kind of circle back to this subject.
We'll have to look into it. Earlier today, I found a PDF of English translations of probably just a bunch of essays of his as well. I'll stick those in the show notes if I remember. It'll be a while before we get around to this on the show, but it's something to keep an eye on, certainly.
Yeah, and so Davenport says, like, well, if you look at the history of cybernetics, sort of like after Bogdanov, you can see that like there's people like von Neumann, who was like, very conservative, wanted to use nuclear weapons to annihilate the entire Soviet Union. Obviously a brilliant scientist, but certainly not a man of the left. Then you have a lot of systems theorists or cyberneticians like Beer or whatever, Wiener, Gray Walter, like who are quite friendly to the left to varying degrees. And like to try to get away from the sort of like Manichaean perspective on like, is systems theory bourgeois or not? Davenport sort of says like, well, you can kind of see this as being similar to the way that Hegelianism played out in the 19th to 20th century, right? So Hegelianism also can kind of be seen as like a proto-systems theory in a way, tried to create like a way of thinking about the world that transcended disciplines and created a sort of general structure for science. Similarly, you have people like Marx, who are influenced by Hegel on the left. Mm-hmm. Then you have like plenty of center Hegelians and right Hegelians. The right Hegelians especially are really interested in like the Prussian state is like the end of history, right? Because you can see these tendencies across the spectrum in like a kind of earlier example of this generalized approach, you could probably see the same thing in cybernetics, right? That like, it doesn't necessarily have one political affiliation, but the direction you want to take it, whether it is towards sort of like refining in a kind of Taylorist way techniques of management in the interest of suppressing the class struggle and reinforcing the privileges of managers and capital owners, or if you want to take it in like the direction that like Beer took it, in terms of like, well, we want to have more democracy, we want to have more autonomy, we want to have a functional organization that gets beyond that stuff. Both of those things are possible within this framework.
It reminds me a lot of the stuff we covered with Feinberg, right, in transforming technology, that like the techniques and technology, like the nuts and bolts of the technologies are ambivalent, and it's the technical code that assembles them that gives it a political character. And it means that you have to be kind of careful, right? Like when you're disassembling the enemy's weapons and taking parts out of them, you do have to be pretty careful and like think through what you're doing. But there's no way in hell that the spring or the lever is like poisoned forever, like ontologically evil because it was associated with some such thing. That would just be a completely harebrained take, which I'm sure someone has taken. In fact, I'm certain of it.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Like definitely, like if Lao Tzu said like as soon as we came up with the wheel, that was it. Like that was a step too far. I'm sure there's some like primitive communists or a primitivist who is like, yeah, the lever, that was it. That was the beginning of the bourgeoisie.
It was always already present in the lever, right? Like the fucking the bourgeois, the capital domination was always there right from the start.
Yeah.
Oh, fuck. Well, that's it for this episode. Catch us again next time for part 2 of our discussion of organising for power. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook, we're on all the podcast apps, so like, rate, subscribe, all the usual stuff. You can also go to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit and throw us a couple of bucks a month to help support the show and to get access to our community Discord. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. You should go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows From Alpha to Omega, Swampside Chats, and Jumpsuit Utopia. They're wonderful shows and wonderful folks. As always, thanks for listening to the show, and we'll catch you again next time. Bye-bye.